Everyone at school mocked me for my anxiety disorder, not knowing I'm a published author with a genius IQ. I sat in the back row of my economics seminar, trying to make myself invisible while the professor lectured about my book, the one I'd published under a pseudonym 2 years ago while in a refugee camp, about how economies rebuild after total collapse. Nobody here knew I was the author. I just looked like a freaked-out kid because my anxiety medication wasn't working and the lights felt too bright, reminding me of when my village burned down. Professor Mitchell noticed my shaking hands and announced to the class, "Looks like someone forgot to take their crazy pills this morning. This is what happens when admissions lets in charity cases who can't handle academic pressure." The entire lecture hall turned to stare at me while I tried to steady my breathing. "Maybe you should go to the counseling center instead of wasting everyone's time here. Actually, maybe you should just go back to whatever bombed-out country you crawled from." I stayed in my seat, focusing on my notes, but my hand was shaking too badly to write clearly. A student in the front row, wearing a designer suit, turned around and said, "He probably can't even understand the lectures. They really lower standards for refugees, don't they? My father says they let them in to make the school look compassionate, not because they can actually learn." Another student added, "He's probably illiterate in his own language too. These people come from places without real schools." When I asked a clarifying question about the material, Professor Mitchell rolled his eyes. "Can someone translate to whatever language he actually speaks? These international diversity admits never have the foundation for real academic work." He wrote my question on the board in deliberately broken English, adding random grammatical errors. "This is how you sound to us, like a child trying to speak. Maybe if your people had schools instead of wars, you could communicate properly." During the break, students surrounded my desk, and one poured coffee on my textbook, then on my notes, then grabbed my laptop and poured it there too. "Oops, but you probably stole this stuff anyway. Which war zone are you from? The one where they rape everyone or the one where they eat people?" They laughed while another said, "He's probably a terrorist. That's why he shakes. Guilty conscience from bombing civilians." When I had a panic attack triggered by someone slamming a door, the whole class started deliberately making loud noises. They slammed books, popped chip bags, and one even played actual war footage on his phone at full volume. "Look, he's crying! The big tough refugee is pissing himself over some noises." Someone took a photo of me curled up shaking. Professor Mitchell didn't stop them, instead saying, "If you can't handle normal classroom sounds, you belong in an asylum, not a university." A girl pretended to be sympathetic but said loudly, "It's not his fault his whole family died and his brain is broken. Some people just aren't meant for civilization. He should be in a psychiatric ward, not taking spots from real humans." She grabbed my face and forced me to look at her. "Poor thing, you tried so hard to pretend you're people, but we can all see you're just a damaged animal." Professor Mitchell assigned group work and announced, "Nobody has to work with him. I won't penalize you for excluding someone who'll drag down your grades. His mental illness might be contagious." Every group rejected me while he watched approvingly. "This is preparing you for the real world. No employer wants someone who might go on a shooting spree. That's what these war people do." When I submitted my paper early, Professor Mitchell held it up and ripped it in half without reading it, then spit on the pieces. "I'm not wasting time grading work from someone who shouldn't be here." He threw the wet pieces at my face. "Your dead family would be ashamed you're wasting this opportunity." The guest speaker arrived, and Professor Mitchell introduced him as the renowned economist whose life was changed by a revolutionary book. As the speaker began, a student grabbed my hair and cut off a chunk with scissors. "For my collection of subhuman samples," he said. Professor Mitchell saw but smiled. Another student said, "After this, you'll finally unalive yourself and stop contaminating our classroom with your mental illness. Do the world a favor." The whole class applauded. The guest speaker was mid-sentence when he suddenly stopped, staring directly at me. "Oh my God," he said, his voice shaking. "You're him. You're the author. I recognize you from the refugee camp documentation." He pushed past students, tears in his eyes. "This is the genius who wrote the book that revolutionized my entire understanding of economics. This young man, who you've been torturing, created the framework that's now being implemented by the World Bank." Professor Mitchell's face went white as the guest speaker reached me and said, "Your book saved my career and changed how we approach post-conflict economics globally." His hands grabbed my shoulders, and I felt the warmth of his palms through my shirt, while tears ran down his cheeks. The entire lecture hall went dead quiet. Every single person stopped moving. Professor Mitchell stood frozen at the front with his mouth hanging open. The marker in his hand dropped and rolled across the floor. My whole body started shaking harder than before. Years of hiding who I really was crashed into this exact moment. The weight of keeping this secret while they hurt me over and over pressed down on my chest. The guest speaker pulled out his phone with one hand while keeping the other on my shoulder. He turned the screen toward the class and showed them a photo from the refugee camp files. The picture showed my face from 2 years ago when I was 16. Everyone could see it matched me exactly, even though I was skinnier back then with dirt on my face. He scrolled to another document that had my full name at the top. "This young man wrote the book that saved my entire career," he said to the room. His voice got louder. "The framework he created changed how we understand economics after war's end." The student who had cut my hair let the scissors fall from his hand. They hit the floor with a metal clang. Professor Mitchell's face stayed white as paper. The guest speaker kept talking while I tried to breathe. "The World Bank uses his ideas right now in 12 different countries." The girl who had grabbed my face earlier took 3 steps backward. Her designer bag fell off her shoulder. Other students started pulling out their phones and pointing them at me. My breathing got faster and shallower. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. The room started to spin a little. Professor Mitchell found his voice and it came out high and weird. "This has to be some kind of mistake." He walked toward us with his hands out. "This student is just a refugee with mental problems who can't handle normal classes." The guest speaker turned his phone toward the professor and showed him an email chain. "These are messages from World Bank officials asking for meetings with the author." He scrolled down more. "Look at the dates and look at his name right there." Professor Mitchell's face went from white to red, like someone was filling him with blood from the bottom up. More students stood up from their seats to get a better look. The guest speaker turned to me, and his voice got soft. "Do you want to say anything to them about what just happened here?" I shook my head back and forth because I couldn't make words come out. My throat felt closed up. These people had spent the last hour breaking me into pieces. He nodded like he understood and moved his arm around my shoulders. I reached for my backpack with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Coffee dripped from my textbook onto the floor. My notes were brown and wet, and the ink had run everywhere. I picked up my laptop and coffee poured out of the keyboard. Several students walked closer, and one said something I couldn't hear through the ringing in my ears. Another one reached out like they wanted to touch me, but pulled their hand back. The guest speaker raised his voice again. "I'm reporting everything I saw here to the administration today." His arm stayed firm around my shoulders. "What you did to this young man is beyond wrong." The classroom felt like it was tilting to one side. I shoved my ruined stuff into my bag while coffee leaked through the bottom. The guest speaker helped me stand up, and we walked toward the door. He turned back to Professor Mitchell. "My presentation is canceled." His voice was cold and flat. "I won't speak in a room where this happens." We went through the door into the hallway, and the bright lights made me squint. He looked at the chunk of hair missing from the side of my head. "Do you need a doctor for that? Or for the burns?" Coffee had soaked through my shirt and left red marks on my skin. I managed to whisper that I just needed somewhere safe to breathe. He guided me down the hall to an empty conference room and helped me sit in a chair. My whole body kept shaking. He found a water fountain and brought me a cup, while I pressed my palms flat on the table and counted my breaths. 5 counts in and 7 counts out like my therapist taught me. The panic started to get smaller after a few minutes. When I could talk again, I asked him to please not tell anyone else about my book for now. "I'm not ready for that kind of attention," I said. He agreed right away and promised to support whatever I decided. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the bald spot where they cut my hair. The flash made it look worse than it was. Then I lifted my shirt and photographed the red marks from the coffee that were starting to hurt. My hands shook so bad the first few pictures came out blurry. The guest speaker wrote his phone number and email on a piece of paper. "I'll be your witness for whatever you need," he said. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. That night back in my dorm, I couldn't stop thinking about everything. I opened my laptop to email disability services about getting help. The coffee had killed it completely, so I used my phone instead. I typed out a message to Maeve Lee explaining that I needed an emergency meeting about accommodations. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I pressed it. She wrote back in less than an hour, saying she could see me first thing in the morning. She marked my case as urgent in the system. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while everything that happened played over and over in my head. The next morning came too fast, and I dragged myself out of bed with maybe 2 hours of sleep total. My phone showed Maeve's confirmation for our 9 o'clock meeting, and I threw on clean clothes without really looking at them. The walk to the Disability Services office took me past the economics building, and my stomach twisted into knots. Inside Maeve's office, she had tissues on the table and a notepad ready while I sat down and started explaining what happened in class. My voice shook when I described the coffee being poured on my stuff and the chunk of hair they cut off. She wrote everything down, and her face got more and more upset as I talked about how the war sounds triggered my panic attack. When I finished, she pulled out a folder and started showing me different accommodation options the school could provide. She explained I could get permission to record lectures, so I wouldn't have to take notes while my hands shook. There were quiet testing rooms available where I could take exams without the bright lights and noise that reminded me of explosions. She typed up the accommodation letter right there and said she'd send it to all my professors today. Her hand touched my shoulder gently when she walked me to the door and told me to email her anytime I needed help. 2 days later, I forced myself to go back to economics class because I couldn't let them win by making me drop out. Professor Mitchell stood at the front and looked right at me when I walked in. He didn't say my name but started talking about how certain students couldn't handle academic pressure and caused disruptions for everyone else. The other students turned to stare at me and started whispering to each other loud enough that I could hear pieces about the crazy refugee kid. Someone behind me kept tapping their pen on the desk in a rhythm that sounded like gunfire. My notebook stayed closed because my hands were shaking too bad to write anything down. Professor Mitchell kept making comments about diversity admits who didn't belong in real universities. Halfway through the class, I stood up and walked out while everyone watched. Back in my dorm, I opened my laptop and started typing out everything that had happened since the semester started. The document filled up fast with dates and exact quotes from Professor Mitchell's comments about refugees and mental illness. I wrote down the names of every student who participated in the abuse and what they did. The timeline went back weeks with smaller incidents I'd tried to ignore before they got worse. Each entry had specific details about who was there and what they saw happen. The list got longer than I expected, and seeing it all written out made the pattern impossible to deny. My fingers kept typing for hours as I remembered more incidents and added them with careful notes about witnesses. 3 days went by while I stared at that document and tried to decide what to do with it. Part of me wanted to just switch to another section quietly and avoid the whole mess. But then I remembered surviving the attack on my village and living through the refugee camp and writing my book while everything burned around me. I opened the university website and found the Institutional Equity Office page with Carol Mackenzie's contact information. My mouse hovered over the appointment link for a long time before I clicked it and selected the first available slot. The confirmation email came through right away, and my anxiety spiked, but I told myself I'd survived worse than this. Carol's office had certificates on the wall and a recording device on the desk when I walked in for my appointment. She asked me to start from the beginning and took notes on her computer while I talked through the whole pattern of discrimination. Her questions were specific about dates and witnesses, and she wanted exact quotes when I could remember them. She pulled up a document explaining the investigation process and my rights during it, including protection from any retaliation. When I mentioned the guest speaker who witnessed everything and recognized me from the refugee camp, her eyes got wide. She asked if I had his contact information, and I gave her the paper he'd written his number on. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number, and the text said it was Omar Santiago from the campus newspaper. He'd heard something big happened in Mitchell's class and wanted to talk off the record if I was willing. We met at the coffee shop in the student center where other people were around for safety. Omar pulled out a notebook and told me he'd been investigating complaints about Professor Mitchell for months. 3 other students had come to him with stories, but none of them wanted to go on record because they were scared. He showed me his notes without names, and the pattern matched exactly what I'd experienced. We agreed to share information carefully, and he gave me his encrypted email address for anything sensitive. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Franklin Doyle, who was the department chair for economics. He wrote that he'd heard I was having difficulties in Professor Mitchell's section and wanted to offer me a transfer to another professor with no penalty. His tone was professional, but there was something underneath that felt like he wanted this to go away quietly. I typed back that I appreciated the offer, but I wanted to stay in my registered class with proper accommodations and protection from discrimination. 20 minutes later, he replied, asking for a meeting to discuss the situation further. While I was reading his email, another message came through from Carol saying the guest speaker had sent his statement. She forwarded me a copy, and it was 3 pages of detailed description about what he witnessed in the classroom. He included documentation from the refugee camp, showing when he met me, and copies of his emails to World Bank officials about my economic framework. The statement used professional language to describe the abuse, but you could feel his anger through the careful words. Carol started her investigation by contacting students from the class and asking for their accounts of what happened. Her email to me said several students had already agreed to provide statements anonymously about what they saw. Some of them felt guilty for not stopping it and wanted to help make things right now. Their statements matched mine about the coffee and the haircutting, and Professor Mitchell encouraging the abuse. One student even had photos on their phone from when I was having the panic attack. I logged into the course website to check my grades and found something that made my jaw drop. Professor Mitchell had entered failing grades for assignments that weren't even due yet. The submission boxes were still closed, but somehow I had zeros for papers nobody had turned in yet. I took screenshots of everything, immediately showing the dates and the closed submission status. Carol's response when I sent them was just 2 words, but I could feel her satisfaction through the screen. The next morning, Maeve sent an official email to Professor Mitchell about my approved accommodations for class. She copied the entire economics department on it and attached all the paperwork from Disability Services. The email listed everything clearly, including extra time for tests, permission to step out if needed, and the right to record lectures. Mitchell's reply came back within an hour, and it was only 3 lines long. He wrote that he would comply with all legal requirements as mandated by the university. The way he phrased it made it sound like he was forced at gunpoint. Maeve forwarded his response to Carol and added a note saying she'd seen this pattern before with him. 2 days later, I was eating lunch in the campus cafeteria when someone dropped their metal tray right behind me. The crash sent me straight into panic mode, and my whole body started shaking. My breathing got fast and shallow while everyone in the cafeteria turned to stare at me. But instead of running away like I usually did, I remembered what Maeve taught me about grounding exercises. I put my hands flat on the table and counted 5 things I could see, then 4 things I could touch. My breathing slowed down bit by bit while I stayed in my seat. After about 3 minutes, I was calm enough to finish my sandwich. It wasn't much, but staying there instead of fleeing felt like winning a small battle. That same afternoon, Omar's article came out in the campus newspaper about discrimination in certain departments. He didn't name Mitchell directly, but anyone who knew the situation could tell who he meant. The piece talked about refugee students facing hostile classroom environments and professors who made comments about their backgrounds. Within hours, the article was shared all over campus social media. Students started commenting with their own stories about similar experiences. The economics department suddenly had a lot more eyes on it. Walking to the library the next day, one of the students from Mitchell's class stepped right in front of me. He grabbed my backpack strap and yanked me backward while telling me I was making trouble for everyone. His face was red, and he kept poking me in the chest, saying I should drop the complaint. 2 campus security officers happened to be walking by and saw the whole thing. They separated us immediately and took both our statements right there on the sidewalk. The student tried to say we were just talking, but the officers wrote down that he'd grabbed me. They gave me a copy of their incident report and said it would be filed with the main security office. Carol called me that evening to say she'd gotten the security report already. She also told me she'd interviewed Mitchell that afternoon about my allegations. He apparently spent the whole interview talking about maintaining academic standards and managing classroom disruptions. He claimed I was too sensitive and couldn't handle normal academic pressure. Carol said his explanations sounded weak when she compared them to all the witness statements she'd collected. She mentioned he seemed nervous and kept asking what evidence she had. The next morning, Omar texted me that someone had leaked an email to him. Mitchell had sent it to other economics professors last semester, complaining about diversity admits and refugee students. In the email, he wrote that these students lowered the quality of education for everyone else. He also made jokes about their English skills and suggested they shouldn't be admitted at all. Omar verified it was real by checking with his sources in the IT department. He published excerpts from it in a follow-up article that afternoon. The administration couldn't pretend they didn't know about the pattern anymore. Franklin called me into his office that same day to suggest mediation between Mitchell and me. He said it would be faster than a formal investigation and might help us both move forward. I told him no immediately and explained that mediation only works when both people have equal power. Mitchell controlled my grades and my academic future, while I had nothing. Franklin seemed surprised by my answer but said he understood my position. Carol later told me she was glad I refused and made a note about it in my file. When I got back to my dorm that night, there was a folded paper under my door. Another refugee student had written to say they knew what I was going through. They shared their own story about facing discrimination from Mitchell 2 years ago. They said they'd been too scared to report it, but seeing me stand up gave them hope. The note was anonymous, but they included details that matched other complaints Carol had mentioned. I scanned it and sent it to her as more evidence of the pattern. She replied saying this showed the problem affected more students than just me. The campus legal aid clinic gave me a free consultation the next week about my rights. The lawyer there explained I had grounds for both a university complaint and possibly a civil case. She went through all my options, including filing with the State Human Rights Commission if needed. Having legal options made me feel less trapped in the situation. She gave me her card and said to call if things got worse. Before leaving, I gave Carol a USB drive with audio recordings from Mitchell's classes. I'd been recording them on my phone to help with note-taking because of my accommodations. The recordings happened to catch several of his discriminatory comments, including the one about charity cases. Carol's eyes got wide when she listened to a sample of them. She confirmed these were admissible evidence, since the syllabus said students could record lectures. The evidence against Mitchell kept growing every day. 2 days later, Carol called me into her office, where she showed me a letter from the university, stating that Professor Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave effective immediately while they investigated the complaints. My hands shook reading it, but not from fear this time. She explained a substitute would take over the economics class starting tomorrow, and Mitchell wasn't allowed on campus or to contact any students during the investigation. When I walked into class the next morning, the whole room felt different without Mitchell standing at the front. The substitute professor, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, introduced herself and said she'd been briefed on the situation. Students actually raised their hands to ask questions instead of staying silent. Some kids who never spoke before started participating. The guy who'd cut my hair wouldn't look at me, but a girl from the second row smiled and nodded when I walked past. Outside class, the reactions split hard. 3 students cornered me by the library to say I was making everything up for attention and that Mitchell was a good professor who just had high standards. They said I was ruining his career because I couldn't handle real academic work. But then 2 other students found me later to say they were glad someone finally reported him. One mentioned he'd made comments about her accent all semester. Another said Mitchell had failed him for missing class during a religious holiday, even though he'd gotten permission. I kept my head down and focused on studying, avoiding the dining hall when I knew the hostile students would be there. The substitute spent her first week reviewing everyone's grades from the semester. She pulled up Mitchell's gradebook on the projector and went through each assignment asking students to confirm what they'd submitted. It turned out Mitchell had been giving arbitrary grades to several students, not just me. She announced she'd regrade everything based on actual merit. When she returned my papers with real feedback and fair grades, I scored in the top 5% of the class. Other students noticed immediately. The same kid who'd said I was too stupid to understand lectures saw my test score posted, and his face went red. The substitute announced she'd arranged accommodations for anyone who needed them. I signed up to take my first exam in a quiet testing room with extra time through disability services. Walking into that small, silent room felt strange, but good. No one staring at me or making sudden noises, just me and the test paper. I worked through each problem carefully without my hands shaking or my mind going blank from panic. When I got the results back, I'd scored 97%, the highest in the entire class. The substitute posted the scores anonymously, but with student ID numbers visible. Everyone could see mine at the top. That night, I got an email from Mitchell's personal account, even though he wasn't supposed to contact students. He wrote that my complaint would destroy any chance I had of getting recommendations for graduate programs or economics internships. He said everyone in the field would know I was a troublemaker who couldn't handle criticism. He mentioned he had connections at every major economics program in the country. I forwarded it immediately to Carol, who replied within minutes telling me not to respond under any circumstances. She said this was clear retaliation and would strengthen my case significantly. She added it to the evidence file and notified the university's legal team about the contact violation. The next morning, the guest speaker emailed asking if we could talk privately. We met at a coffee shop off campus where he said he wanted to provide sworn testimony to the hearing committee about my authorship if I was comfortable with that. He pulled out a folder with photos from the refugee camp, correspondence about my book, and emails from World Bank officials discussing my framework. He said he'd respect whatever I decided, but wanted me to know he'd support me completely. I told him I needed time to think about revealing that part of my identity. He gave me his business card and said to call anytime, day or night, when I decided. Later that week, I sat in Maeve's office going through the pros and cons of letting the committee know about my authorship. She had a whiteboard where we mapped out the potential impacts on my privacy, my academic career, and my mental health. She pointed out it would give context to Mitchell's discrimination, but might also bring unwanted attention. We talked about how I'd handle questions about why I hid it and whether I was ready for people to know. She said there was no wrong answer, just what felt right for me. She reminded me I'd already shown incredible courage just by filing the complaint. After 3 days of thinking about it constantly, I decided to let the guest speaker tell the committee, but ask them to keep it confidential from the broader campus. I called him and explained I wanted the committee to understand the full context of who Mitchell was discriminating against, but wasn't ready for public recognition. He said that was perfectly reasonable, and he'd make that clear in his testimony. We drafted a statement together about maintaining my privacy while ensuring the committee had complete information. Franklin Doyle asked to meet with me in his office, where he stood up when I entered and actually apologized. He said the department had failed to protect me and other vulnerable students from Mitchell's behavior. He offered to arrange an independent study for next semester, so I wouldn't have to be in regular classes if I didn't feel safe. I thanked him, but said I wanted to continue with normal classes as long as proper oversight was in place. He agreed and promised the department would monitor all professors more carefully. He also mentioned they were reviewing Mitchell's past course evaluations and grade distributions. Omar texted me that afternoon saying his investigation had turned up something big. We met in the student newspaper office, where he showed me records he'd obtained through public information requests. 3 previous complaints had been filed against Mitchell over the past 5 years, all from refugee or international students. Each time the complaints were handled quietly, with no real consequences. One student had transferred schools, another had dropped out entirely, and the third had switched majors to avoid Mitchell. The pattern was clear and went back years. Omar said he was writing a feature story about systemic failures in protecting vulnerable students, but would keep my name out of it unless I gave permission. I agreed to let him use the information carefully if it helped other students. 2 days later, Carol called me to her office, where 2 other students were waiting. They both looked nervous, but determined, as they told me about their own experiences in Mitchell's other classes. One was from Syria and had been called a terrorist repeatedly, while Mitchell ignored it. The other was from Somalia, and Mitchell had refused to grade her work fairly all semester. They wanted to add their complaints to mine after hearing about my case through the campus grapevine. Carol took their statements and said this pattern made the case much stronger. The investigation expanded to include all of Mitchell's classes over the past 3 years. More emails started coming to Carol from former students who had transferred or dropped out because of him. The hearing date got set for 3 weeks out, and I felt my stomach drop when I saw the official notice. Maeve arranged for us to practice my testimony the night before in her office. Carol came too, and they walked me through what to expect from the committee. We went over each incident I'd documented and how to present it clearly. They helped me practice staying calm when describing the worst parts. Maeve taught me breathing exercises to use if I started panicking during testimony. Carol explained the committee would ask questions, but they'd be respectful, unlike a court cross-examination. We practiced until almost midnight with them playing different committee members. I barely slept that night, thinking about facing the committee in the morning. I kept reminding myself I'd survived my village burning when I was 12. I'd lived in a refugee camp for 3 years and still managed to write a book. I'd taught myself economics from donated textbooks while bombs fell nearby. This committee couldn't be scarier than any of that. I put on my only suit and looked at myself in the mirror. My hands were shaking, but I made myself stand straight. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, with a long table where 5 committee members sat. I recognized 2 professors from other departments and 3 administrators I'd never met. They introduced themselves and explained the process would be recorded. I started with the first class, where Mitchell called me a charity case. I showed them my documentation and photos of the coffee burns on my skin. I described each incident in order without crying, even when my voice shook. The committee members took notes and asked me to clarify certain details. One asked if I'd reported anything earlier, and I explained I was scared of retaliation. Another asked about my accommodations and how Mitchell had responded to them. I showed them the screenshots of him failing assignments I hadn't submitted yet. They looked at each other with concern when they saw those. After my testimony, they brought in the guest speaker who'd witnessed the haircutting incident. He wore an expensive suit and spoke with the authority of someone used to testifying. He described exactly what he'd seen and heard in that classroom. Then he explained who I really was and what my book had accomplished globally. The committee members sat up straighter when he mentioned the World Bank implementation. He showed them emails from international economists praising my framework. He pulled out a copy of my book and read a passage about rebuilding after trauma. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Mitchell had been teaching from my work while abusing me. One committee member asked if he could verify my authorship, and he showed the refugee camp documentation. Mitchell's lawyer tried to object, but the committee chair shut him down immediately. When Mitchell's turn came, his lawyer tried to make me look unreliable because of my PTSD. He asked if my mental health issues might make me misinterpret normal classroom interactions. I stayed calm and explained my accommodations help me succeed, like glasses help someone see. I pointed out my grades in other classes were all A's when professors followed the accommodations. The lawyer tried to suggest I was too sensitive for academic discourse. I responded that there's a difference between academic rigor and personal attacks about dead family members. The committee didn't look impressed with his arguments at all. One committee member actually told the lawyer to stick to relevant questions. After 6 hours of testimony and deliberation, the committee called us back in. They issued an immediate no-contact order, meaning Mitchell couldn't come near me or contact me. They recommended formal censure and mandatory bias training before he could teach again. They referred all the students who'd participated in the abuse to student conduct boards. The chair said this was one of the clearest cases of discrimination they'd seen. I felt my shoulders drop as months of tension started to release. Franklin called me the next day to say Mitchell wouldn't be teaching for at least a year. The department was implementing a full climate review and hiring an outside firm to assess the culture. He assigned me a faculty mentor who specialized in post-conflict economics and actually knew my work. The changes weren't just about me, but about making sure this couldn't happen again. Other vulnerable students would have protection now that didn't exist before. Omar and I met at the campus coffee shop to discuss writing an op-ed about the broader issues. We decided to focus on systemic barriers facing refugee students, rather than my personal story. We spent hours crafting it carefully to promote policy changes without making it about me. Omar had great ideas about framing it as an institutional responsibility issue. The piece ran in the campus paper the next week, with the headline about hidden talent being wasted. The response was bigger than we expected, with dozens of comments online. Students started sharing their own stories of discrimination in various departments. A few critics claimed we were attacking academic freedom, but their arguments looked weak. The documented evidence made it hard to deny the real problems that existed. 2 weeks later, the substitute instructor posted our final grades online, and I stared at the A next to my name for a full minute. My hands weren't shaking anymore as I took a screenshot from my records. The grade calculation showed my papers and exams all scored in the top percentile once someone actually read them. Other students from the class started getting emails from student conduct about their hearings, and I heard through Omar that they were panicking. The guy who cut my hair got called in first and came out looking pale and shaken. Carol sent me updates as each case moved through the system without needing me to testify again. The conduct board suspended the haircutter for assault and made him do 200 hours at the Refugee Resettlement Center downtown. 3 others got academic probation and had to take workshops about discrimination and bias every Saturday morning for the whole next semester. The girl who grabbed my face had to write a 10-page reflection paper about dehumanization that would go in her permanent file. Mitchell's case took longer, but Franklin finally called me into his office to explain the outcome. The university gave Mitchell formal censure, which meant a permanent mark on his employment record that would follow him everywhere. They removed him from all teaching duties for a full year, and he had to complete intensive bias training before he could even apply to return. He kept his tenure because of union rules, but his reputation was destroyed, and everyone knew why he wasn't teaching. I started going to the counseling center twice a week to work on my PTSD with a therapist who specialized in war trauma. She taught me breathing techniques that actually helped when doors slammed or loud noises happened. The panic attacks still came, but I learned to recognize the warning signs and get somewhere safe before they peaked. We worked on separating past trauma from present triggers, and I practiced grounding exercises between sessions. Spring semester started, and all my new professors had my accommodation letter already in their systems. They let me sit near exits and take breaks without asking permission, and nobody made comments about it. The professor for my international economics course actually pulled me aside to say she'd read my book and wanted to discuss it during office hours. I built study groups with other students who understood my needs, and we met in quiet spaces on campus. The guest speaker emailed me about working together on a policy paper for the UN about implementing my economic framework in Syria and Yemen. We met every Thursday afternoon in his office downtown, going through data and case studies. He treated me like a colleague instead of a student, and actually listened when I suggested changes to his models. The paper would have both our names as equal authors when it got published in the summer. 3 students from Mitchell's class found me in the library one afternoon looking nervous and uncomfortable. They said they'd been thinking about what happened and realized they should have spoken up instead of laughing along. One admitted he'd been too scared of Mitchell to say anything, but knew that was no excuse for letting it continue. I told them I accepted their apologies, but we weren't going to be friends, and they seemed to understand that boundary. More students started nodding at me in hallways or holding doors open like I was just another person on campus. The International Student Office asked if I'd speak at orientation for new refugee students, but I said I needed more time before I was ready for that. Walking past the economics building one morning, I decided to take the long way past Mitchell's old lecture hall. The door was open, and a different professor was teaching a completely different class inside. Students were actually raising hands and asking questions without fear, and nobody was getting mocked or humiliated. I stood there for a moment watching normal education happen in that space where so much pain had happened to me. My shoulders stayed relaxed, and my breathing stayed steady as I watched them learn. I walked away with my backpack feeling lighter than it had in months and headed to my next class. The truth about who I was had changed everything, even though most people still didn't know about my book. Some stories would stay private between me and my therapist, and others I'd share when I felt strong enough. The system had worked slowly, but it had worked, and other students wouldn't face what I faced in that room. My grades stayed high, and my panic attacks got more manageable, and I kept working on the policy paper that would help rebuild economies. Everything that happened made me stronger, even though I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. The university was different now, with new policies and training and oversight that hadn't existed before my complaint. I controlled my story now, and nobody could take that away from me again. Thanks for letting me poke around these questions with you today. Really hope my little wonderings were worth your time. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.